Welcome to this Angular at Work series in which we cover dependency injection. Not only am I going to teach you exactly what dependency injection is, but I'm going to teach you its most important features. Features such as dependency providers. I'll teach you each of the 4 types of dependency providers, how to create them, and how to use them in your code. I'll also teach you about injection tokens, how to create those and use those in code. We'll also cover the 4 types of resolution modifiers. And I'll also discuss the difference between providers and view providers. So now that you know exactly what we'll be discussing in this series, before I begin discussing dependency injection itself and covering its features, I first want to show you why it's important to know all of these things about Angular dependency injection, because we can use dependency injection in everyday coding tasks that help us perform these things much more efficiently. So what I want to do in this first video is to show you 2 techniques that use dependency injection in ways you might have never thought about before. The first technique I'm going to show you is how to console log values for specific methods and properties in your code without actually adding console log statements, peppering your code with console log statements. The second technique I'm going to show you is how to create and use mock data in your application, because sometimes we need to change our front end according to conditions in our backend data. But for whatever reason, our development environment might not have the data we need to make our front-end changes. So that's when a mock data service comes in handy. Here on my screen, I have an Angular application open in VS Code on the left, and on the right, I have that application running locally in my browser. And as you can see, there are, on this page of the application, this to-array page of the application, there are a number of cards, and each card consists of customer data, specifically customer banking data. To produce the data for these cards, the to-array service has injected into it the API service, and it's the API service that's making the backend calls to retrieve all the data being used. And currently, you see that the to-array service is using 3 observables from the API service. It's using the all customers observable property. It's using the get account by customer ID observable method. And it's also using the transactions for ID observable method. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to log to the console the values that are being emitted by these observables. But I'd like to do it without peppering this code, without adding any console logs to this service. Because if I try to, for example, add a console log to the all customers pipeline, notice what happens. I'm getting an error. And the reason that I'm getting an error in this pipeline, it's not really anything to do with the console logging itself. It has to do with the fact that this pipeline already consists of 9 operators. And that is a limitation of RxJS. Whenever you set the return type of an observable, its pipeline can only have 9 or fewer operators. By adding the tap operator to do the console logging, it's a 10th operator. So essentially, in order to console log the value of this observable, I'd have to break this up. And I really don't want to modify this code. Everything is working and I don't want to modify it. And actually, it's not really necessary to do that, because Angular has a mechanism that we can use to retrieve values from properties and methods as they're being set. And this mechanism is called a decorator. Angular provides a number of built-in decorators, and we can use decorators to retrieve information from classes, from properties, from methods, and also from parameters. So for instance, there is a built-in Angular class decorator called injectable. And we use the injectable decorator when we create services. So those are built-in decorators, but we can also create our own decorators. And to retrieve data from an observable property or an observable method, I've created these two custom decorators, one called log observable method and the other called log observable property. And as their names state, the log observable method decorator retrieves the emitted value from an observable method. Likewise, the log observable property decorator retrieves the value from an emitted property, such as the all customers property on the API service. Now we can use either of these custom decorators to retrieve values from either an observable method or an observable property in our code. Now you might be thinking that in order to use these decorators, I'd still have to apply the decorator above the given property or method, but I don't need to do that. I can use a service to do that. So what I've done here is I've created an experimental service, which it too has the API service injected into it. And using this service, I'm going to redefine the API properties and methods to new properties and methods with the same corresponding names. And I'll decorate those items with their corresponding log observable property or log observable method. So what I have in the experimental service is I have an identical service to the API service that's being injected into this toArray service. But now this new experimental service will use the decorators and console.log all of the emitted values from the methods and properties. So essentially all I have to do now is in the toArray service that's being used to produce this card data, I can just replace this API service with the new experimental service. And as you can see, the code properly compiles. And now if I open my console, I have all of that data logged to my console. I have the all customers data logged to the console, and I have for each call to the get account by customer ID method and the transactions for ID method, I have all of the data emitted for those things as well. So this is a technique that you can use to console log data to help you in debugging and investigating how a particular piece of code is working. And they don't have to be observable properties and methods. You can do the same thing with regular properties and methods. And actually in my decorators, I do have decorators that will log regular methods and regular properties. So this is a technique that you can use to do console logging in your application without actually having to modify your code and add multiple console logs to your code with the use of Angular decorators, custom decorators, and services and dependency injection. This is a technique that we can use to do console logging without modifying our existing code. We can just extend and create new things to do the console logging. So that's technique number one. For the second technique, I'm going to show you how to create a mocked instance of your backend data, again, without modifying the existing code. And you'd probably want to perform this technique when, let's say, you have to make a front end change. Let's say for this particular application, the users requested that for any customer that has 5 or more accounts totaling $250,000 or more, for those customers, the users would like to see some sort of visual indicator on the card, such as maybe a border around the card, or maybe the total could be displayed in a different color. And in order to do that, we need a version of the data which includes a customer that has the qualifying conditions. However, currently there are no customers in the backend with more than 5 accounts. The maximum number of accounts for any given customer is 4 at the moment, and there are no customers that have accounts that total $250,000 or more. So in order to make this front end change, we somehow have to add data to our back end that would allow us to make our front end change and have it show up in our front end. But without having the appropriate data in the back end, we can't do that. So one of the things that we might do is we might have the back end development team, or we ourselves as full stack developers might add the necessary back end data. And of course, that would involve steps that would probably take some time. Our other option would be to use, if there is an existing way within our application to manually add that data, say via forms or something of that nature. And of course, that too would take some time. An easier, more efficient, less time-consuming way would be to mock the data that's being used in the front end. And actually, the first step to mocking our backend data is to do what we've already done, and that's to console log out our data from the backend. Because essentially what we can do is we can grab a sampling of our console data and manipulate that in such a way that we get an instance of what we need to perform our front end change. So let me show you what I mean by that. So we have our data being console log. We have our API data being console log using the first technique that we just learned. Now what we can do is, in order to copy and paste some of the customers and accounts, I can modify the decorator so that the output, the console output, is a JSON string instead of an object. And I'll do that for both of the decorators. And now, as you can see in the console, all of our data is consoled as strings, our customer data, as well as our account data and transaction data. But we only need a sampling really of our customer data and our accounts data that fulfills the conditions that we're going to be making the front end change for. And again, we need a customer that has 5 or more accounts totaling over $250,000. So essentially, we can modify our experimental service, and instead of having our all customers property return the same data as the backend all customers property, we can replace the backend call with a static call using the of operator. And what I'll do first is I will copy one of the customers from the console all customers database. So I'll copy this first customer object for the customer with the ID 32926877. I'll copy this object and I'll replace the call to the backend all customers property with a static of operator call using the data that I just copied from the console. And now we should see, for our cards, we should just see the one customer. And indeed we do. We see that one customer that I just copied. Now all we have to do is modify the accounts object for this customer to reflect 5 or more accounts, to include 5 or more accounts. So here is the console logged array of accounts for this particular customer. I can copy that array from the console, and just as I did with the all customers property, I can replace the return of the get accounts by customer ID with a static version of the array I just copied. And I can format this, and as the application reloads, we'll see in the cards, we'll see the same number of accounts that we had previously for this customer, but now all we need to do is add additional accounts. And I can copy the existing accounts and add them to the array. And now we'll have 6 accounts for this particular customer. We're mocking the data so that we have 6 accounts, and our total isn't yet over $250,000, but we can easily make a modification by increasing one of the accounts by, let's say, $100,000. Now we should have all of the data necessary to make our front end data. And what we've done is we have mocked the existing data that's coming from the back end by console logging it out and copying it as static data. So now that we have this, we can actually make our front end change, and we can make modifications to the number of accounts so that we test that our code is valid. So there you have it, 2 everyday uses of Angular Dependency Injection. I hope this persuades you to want to learn more, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can get notified of the next videos in our series. And also, if you found this helpful, please give it a like and leave a comment. If you're wondering about the application that I used in this video, it's from my course, RxJS Subjects and Operators, what they do and when to use them. In it, I teach RxJS in the same way that I did in this video, using real-world examples that you can use in your own applications. You can find a link to the course in the description of this video.